page gets 2 rectangles?
I know, I think my mom and my dad are on one of the page rectangles, and I think True Sister page is one of the other the other rectangles. I don't know what's going on over there.
That's really nice that your parents can attend your presentation.
Yeah, we were just saying a moment ago that I presented my research material 2 years ago, almost to the day today, and my family and my boyfriend Craig all drove out to Amherst to see me, and now we're here on Zoom. So it's really nice that they, support my research and everything.
I was remembering that as well, Kylie, which is probably a good segue into getting started, unless I should wait another. I'll go ahead and start introducing you because the prime time is going to be when Kylie starts. So I'd like to start out by thanking all of you for coming and welcoming you to the honors thesis defense of Kylie Dubé. And Kylie and I met back in the fall of 2018 by chance at an SPHHS Dean's Advisory Committee mixer. I was a new faculty member looking for research assistants, and Kylie was an honors student looking for research opportunities that would combine her interest in Spanish and communication disorders. And so it was a perfect match, and the rest is history. Kylie has been a key member of my lab since her sophomore year. And we were just remembering that just about 2 years ago, she gave a presentation for her independent honors project, independent study, about how she was helping to develop a protocol to transcribe and code language switching in picture descriptions by bilingual children. And then she took a lead on submitting that to ASHA, and it was accepted, but then ASHA was canceled. But now, as a testament to Kylie's constant drive to take on new challenges, she's going to tell you about her thesis, which is about something very different, going from analyzing children's language to now looking at the practices of speech-language pathologists. Kylie has shown a lot of independence and maturity in this project, and it's been a pleasure to supervise her. And so before I turn it over to Kylie, just a couple Zoom logistics. Kylie's going to give a presentation of her thesis. If you could please keep yourselves on mute. You can put questions in the chat and I will monitor it, but we're going to save questions until the end. Once Kylie is finished, her committee member, Dr. Andrianopoulos, will have an opportunity to ask some questions. I'll ask a few questions and then we'll open it up to the general audience. So that's kind of our plan. And now I will turn it over to Kylie.
Sure. Thank you, Megan, for that wonderful introduction. It's so nice to see our journey come full circle with a thesis that I am really proud of. So I'm excited to present it today. So I'm going to share my screen and we'll get started. Okay, so first I wanted to say welcome to everyone who's attending today. It's really amazing to see so many of faces that mean a lot to me. So I'm very happy that you're all here. Here we go. So my thesis is entitled Speech-Language Pathologists, Language Choices During Speech-Language Therapy for Bilingual Children. So to start the presentation today, I wanted to provide some background on the motivation of the project. So we're looking here at the bilingual clinician-client mismatch that exists in the United States. This represents children aged 5 years or older. And as you can see here, there is a large gap in the large number of Spanish-speaking children compared to the very small number of here specifically Spanish-speaking SLPs that are able to provide services in both of a child's languages. Now, this is representing Spanish, which is one of the most commonly spoken languages in the United States. So any other language that a client might be speaking, this gap between the clinician and the client is going to be made even larger. So looking at bilingual intervention practices, it has demonstrated and consistently demonstrated these positive effects on not only a child's home language, but also the majority language, so L1 and L2. And there's a gap in knowledge about intervention practices, specifically in the United States, but also in Massachusetts, and that's what my project is going to explore. So these are my research questions to address the project a little more specifically. They are, what are the language choices made by SLPs during intervention with bilingual children in Massachusetts? What are some of the factors that are influencing their choices? And how are SLPs providing services in a language that they do not speak, regardless of if they are bilingual or monolingual? The project was a mixed methods approach project with a quantitative survey, but also a qualitative interview, which I will address later. But the survey was engaged by 64 individuals, 34 completed it, and 32 participants were analyzed for data. 11 of the SLPs were monolingual, 21 of the SLPs had knowledge of a language besides English. And I'll define those categories in a little bit. So at the end of the survey, participants had the option of expressing interest in the interview study, but within the survey, we asked a lot of different questions, such as demographic information, but I was very interested in hearing their experiences with code switching. So code switching is the alternation of languages within a conversation or even at the sentence level. There are some examples for you to look at here, but I was interested to hear about some of their experiences with code switching, what it looks like in their sessions with their clients, etc. So this is what the quantitative survey looked like. It was done through Qualtrics. And like I mentioned, I wanted to define bilingual versus monolingual for the context of the present study. So in the bilingual group, we had low proficiency bilinguals, this green box, which was an elementary or limited working proficiency in a language other than English. We had high proficiency bilinguals, which was this professional working proficiency through a native-like proficiency in a language other than English, and then of course monolingual. And as you can see here, it was really interesting to see that the groups were pretty evenly split. So it was interesting to look at the data in terms of these three groups. The survey participants, some of the information that we gathered from the survey is presented here. So it's broken up by the three groups in the descriptive data. And it's interesting to see that most of the SLPs had 10 plus years of experience. Most of them were working in a school environment, and a lot of them were working with this preschool, elementary age clients. And over on the right, you can see a lot of the languages that the SLPs reported speaking. There's a variety of languages. 26 reported that they spoke English, but all of the participants, so all 32 spoke English, just some of them didn't write it down in the survey. So it's interesting to see the background of the SLPs and also the languages that they spoke. Now it's interesting to look at the languages of the clients. There are way more languages spoken by the clients than by the clinicians themselves. So we have the client languages, the number of SLPs who reported their clients speaking the language, and the number of the average number of clients. And then on the right are one language spoken by one client that they reported. So there's a large variety of languages here, and it's really interesting to see some of the languages that the SLPs reported. The qualitative interview happened after the quantitative survey. So 16 participants indicated on the survey that they would be interested in the Zoom interview. 10 participants were contacted via follow-up email. 6 participated and 5 interviews were analyzed for data. 3 of the SLPs were school-based, 2 were in early intervention, 4 were bilingual, and the other was monolingual. Some of the questions that I asked in the interview are on the right here, and they were mainly follow-up questions to a lot of the themes that were in the survey. So the interviews were done over Zoom like we are right now, and the coding of the interviews was done in vivo. So I went in, used deductive and inductive strategies to code some of the larger themes in the interviews, and then we related them to some of the themes that we saw in the survey results. So looking at some of the results, I wanted to address each research question individually to give a better overall look at how I answered some of the questions that I was curious about. So looking at research question 1, or what are the language choices made by the SLPs? As you can see, we were looking at the mean proportion of bilingual children on the SLP's caseloads. and what language of therapy their clients were receiving. So we looked at L1 and L2 with assistance. So if the SLP was using a family member for assistance, a bilingual paraprofessional, a bilingual SLPA, L1 and L2 by the SLP themselves. The client was only receiving their dominant language or only receiving their non-dominant language because it was the language of schooling. So the black asterisks show where we found statistically significant results. So we could see that the low bilingual and the monolingual SLPs are providing services in only the non-dominant language more frequently than the high bilingual SLPs. And for L1 and L2 by the SLP themselves, the high bilingual SLPs were doing this at a statistically significant rate compared to the low bilingual SLPs and the monolingual SLPs. Additionally, in research question 1, I wanted to look further than just what language are their clients receiving, but also which model are they receiving their services in. So I looked at the average frequency rating of a 0 to 3 and what the L1, L2 model was of these 3 groups. So looking at L1 and L2 within the same activity, L1 and L2 in separate activities, or L1 and L2 in separate sessions entirely. And it was really interesting to see that the high bilingual SLPs are incorporating both languages into the same activity much more than low bilingual SLPs and the monolingual SLPs. And right away, this made me think that they are probably code switching a lot more, switching back and forth, even within the sentence level or in the conversation level, within the same activity with their bilingual clients. So to look at research question 1 again, this was found to be true. So it was found that 8 out of 11 high proficiency bilingual SLPs and 6 out of 10 of the low proficiency bilingual SLPs reported code switching in at least some of their sessions, compared to only 1 out of 11 monolingual SLPs. However, code switching by their clients wasn't very different. So we can see that, still some of the SLPs reported that they're code switching with their clients sometimes or most of the time. So it's really interesting to see this division of what the SLPs are doing versus what their clients are doing in terms of switching their languages. So to address research question 2, or what factors are influencing their choices, I looked at importance factors to the SLPs within the survey. So this was based on the average importance rating of a 1 to 5, and then which factor they're taking into account. So we looked at language of the child, language of community, language of the school, language of the SLP, and severity of their communication disorder. And as you can see, a lot of them were of similar ratings, but the language of the school, the monolingual SLPs, are taking this more into account and having it as a more important rating than the low bilingual SLPs and the high bilingual SLPs. And research question 3, how are SLPs providing services in a language that they do not speak? We looked at the proportion of the group that is reported using certain types of assistance. So interpreters, translators, online resources, family members, and paraprofessionals. And it was really interesting to see that the high bilingual and low bilingual SLPs relied on interpreters and translators much more than the monolingual SLPs. And you might think that this might be the opposite because the monolingual SLPs might need these resources more, but it was found that the bilingual groups were using interpreters and translators much more. So I also wanted to look at barriers and needs, which also falls under research question 3. And I looked at 3 different groups. So I looked at shared languages with bilingual clients. So the SLPs who reported no shared language with bilingual clients, they had a top barrier and need of having a lack of bilingual SLPs at their disposal. And one SLP mentioned, the district has difficulty finding bilingual SLPs to evaluate. Bilingual speech therapy is not offered or provided to students, just ELL services. When I looked at language shared with all bilingual clients, lack of support in translator interpreters were their top barrier, and resources and trainings was their top need. And one SLP mentioned, another barrier I've encountered is the lack of awareness in administrators, policymakers, and professionals in the appropriate use of tools and techniques for identifying bilingual individuals who need support from an SLP to the use of tools for developing intervention plans. And when I looked at languages shared with most or some of their bilingual clients, lack of support was their top barrier, resources and trainings, and translators and interpreters was their top need. And one SLP mentioned, my caseload includes children who speak 8 different languages. I do not receive any support for bilingual students beyond bilingual evaluations if I request them, and the information that I seek out from ELL teachers or families. And these things are really interesting to hear some of the direct quotes from the SLPs in terms of what bilingual services looks like in their place of work and what they're desiring to better provide these services. I also, in addition to some of the barriers and needs, I asked the SLPs about some of the strategies that they're using in their practices for providing bilingual intervention. And this word cloud here shows the top 50 words mentioned by SLPs in our interviews when I asked about these strategies. And as you can see, they have, using some of the translators here, using parents, looking to the district, trying to make some of these targets here. So this word cloud is really interesting to look at in terms of some of the big themes that came up. So in terms of some of the conclusions that I have drawn from the project overall, I've really noticed that SLPs have different practices, but they all share very similar values and needs. So the monolingual SLPs were less likely than bilingual SLPs to be providing services in both languages of their clients, even with assistance. And when they're providing services to children in a language that the SLP doesn't speak, the monolingual SLPs are reporting relying on translators and interpreters at a significantly lower rate than the bilingual SLPs. And this is interesting because although they have these different practices, they have very similar things that they are valuing and needing when they're thinking about providing bilingual intervention to their clients. So they shared similar needs in resources and training and evaluations, access to bilingual staff and also collaboration with bilingual staff, and also the use and access to translators and interpreters. So some of the limitations and directions for future research, I was definitely limited by having a small sample size, only looking at Massachusetts. It was also a volunteer sample, and I had a very short time frame for the project, which limited some of the things I was able to do with the data. Also, some of the wording of the questions, both in the survey and interview, didn't allow for SLPs to report specific practices to specific clients. It was more a general overview of their practices. And in terms for future research, I would definitely like to do more detailed coding, looking at some of the codes. I'd like to make them a little bit more specific. Having a larger sample size, maybe having the project be US-based instead of just the state of Massachusetts. I would also like to have more perspectives for the interview portion. So I emailed a lot of the SLPs that I was interested in hearing from, and a lot of them didn't respond or couldn't participate in the project. And I only had one monolingual SLP. So I'd like to have a more diverse interview portion and population. I would also like to use this research to increase opportunities for identifying and developing some more resources based on what the findings were. So whether it's developing some programs for ASHA or MASHA to provide some of these resources that SLPs are looking for, and also advocating for bilingual SLPs and bilingual families with bilingual clients. I think it's important to make sure that as a future professional, we're taking into account advocating for these individuals. I think that would be a really great direction for some future research. I wanted to thank all of the people who made this project possible and all my research. So I want to thank Dr. Megan Gross and her Umass Startup Funds. I want to thank Dr. Marian Drunopoulos for being on my committee. These two were crucial in me being able to complete my project, and I could not have done it without them. I'd like to thank my family, my mom, dad, my sister Paige, for allowing me to receive this education and explore research. They have been instrumental, and they are my team, and they let me explore my research and education, so thank you. I'd like to thank Tanya Tran, who transcribed all of my interviews from Zoom, and it's very tedious and very detailed, and she did a wonderful job, so thank you so much. I'd like to thank my lab team as well for hearing my presentation like a million times and giving me feedback. They were a very important part of my presentation. I'd like to also thank the SLP participants in the study and the volunteers who help with testing protocols and document editing. All these people made my project possible. So thank you so much for attending today. If you have any questions about what I presented, please feel free to email me. I'd be happy to answer any questions after today. But thank you so much. That's all I have to present today.
Thank you so much, Kylie. So we'll start with questions from Kylie's other committee member, Dr. Andrianopoulos.
Hello. I have a couple of questions, Kylie. Very nice job on your research. Your mixed method analyses, it's really time-consuming coding and analyzing such data. So I appreciate the dedication to this work. I have a couple of questions. So did you get a sense how many children were on the individual's caseload? Did they tell you how many students were on their caseload?
Right, so we asked specifically about what languages the children on their caseload spoke, and it was only the bilingual clients that they had, because we really wanted to get a good idea of, you know, how many clients did they have and what languages did their clients speak. So that's the information that we gathered in terms of number of clients.
So the inclusion criteria were SLPs who are bilingual and provide bilingual services to children from bilingual backgrounds.
Right, yeah, so the SLPs didn't need to be bilingual. They just needed to have clients who spoke multiple languages.
Okay, did they have clients that were monolingual too?
I would assume that they did have clients who were monolingual. We didn't ask specifically about, you know, their overall clients and what, you know, what all of them spoke, whether they were monolingual or bilingual. But I was really interested in the variety of languages other than English that their clients spoke.
Okay, and then your table 1, the characteristics of monolingual versus bilingual SLPs, the disorders that the clients exhibit. I noticed that language and autism spectrum disorder were the ones that were rated the highest.
Yes.
So when SLPs were filling the survey out, did they check all the disorders? Okay, so even though there can be a child on the autism spectrum and that child has issues with social, emotional, and language, then that SLP checked off more than one selection per client.
Yes, so the question in Qualtrics had it so that they could select all that applied for their clients. So, you know, if they were seeing a client with ASD, but also, you know, had a client with a language disorder, they just clicked all the ones that applied in that question.
Okay. Okay, there was one other question that I had for you, but I'll open it up to others while I'm thinking of my other question. I had one more for you, but I won't use up your time.
Sure, of course.
I can jump in with a couple questions, and then if you think of the other one, feel free, and then we can open it up more broadly. Kylie and I have had a chance to talk about this quite a bit, so my questions are kind of like application type questions. So what would be your top 3 recommendations to address some of the barriers that you encountered? Let's say, you know, the president of MASHA calls you up and says, okay, Kylie, what should we do?
Right. Right. Yeah, I think that's a really meaningful question, especially with some of the motivations behind the project. I think I was aiming to, you know, answer that overall question of like, what should we do next? Or, you know, if I'm an SLP who's struggling to provide services, what should I do? And I think my top 3, you know, recommendations would be, number 1, joining a group like MASHA or ASHA. I think if SLPs are not already in some of those groups, they have a lot of resources that are available. And I think finding people with common interests can be really beneficial. And a lot of the SLPs in the interviews kind of express those things. So I would definitely say joining a group. I would also say educating yourself on some of the things that you're interested about. I know one of the SLPs who practiced the interview with me expressed that she was not trained to be a bilingual SLP. She hadn't received any formal training, yet she was able to, educate herself and also advocate for others. So I would definitely say, look into it yourself, find resources, as well as those larger groups. And then I would also say working with families is a really important way of addressing a lot of the barriers and needs in terms of using them as translators and interpreters, getting the family involved with therapy, learning about how the child uses both of their languages so that you can create the best plan that you can in addressing a child's languages. And I think those would be the three things, especially based on some of the conversations I had with the SLPs in the interviews.
Thank you, because it sounds like they do provide translators and interpreters for evaluations, which is when we probably wouldn't want family members taking that role, but then for for intervention,
Yeah.
they are kind of at a loss and not being given the resources. So thank you for sharing those insights. And I guess my next question is, you sort of touched on it, but now that you're going off to University of Wisconsin to become an SLP, what are some takeaways that you would take from this project into your future practice?
Sure. I think based on some of the conversations in the interviews and, even some of the open-ended questions in the surveys, it's just important to understand that when I go into, grad school or become a future professional, everyone has their own ideas of what bilingual services look like. And there's not just one definition that, covers everything of what bilingual services look like. And it was really eye-opening to see that each one of my interview participants and people in the survey, had their own values and their own views. And I think it's important to head into my next steps in my career open-minded and being able to understand that everyone has a different background, everyone has had a different education, everyone's going to practice differently with their clients. And I think being able to adapt to different families, different clients, different SLPs you're working with, whether it's OTs, PTs, everyone has their own views on what, bilingual services look like and working with their clients. And I think that's something that is invaluable that I'll take away from the project, aside from all the data and results and all those things, which were important to me. But I think that's one of the most important things I'll take away from the project.
Thank you. Dr. A, did you remember your?
Yeah, I did. I had a couple of them, but I'll just ask one more question. I hear this at conferences or when speaking where there are groups of people talking about autism spectrum disorder. And frequently I hear, if they're on the severe spectrum, or they have a general intellectual ability, it's better to simplify and deliver services either in L1 or L2 or what the primary language is going to be. Did you find any of the SLPs expressing that opinion?
Yes, so not specifically to autism spectrum disorder, but I did have one SLP who made it very clear, not in a negative way at all, but very clear that they've been instructed to only provide services in English, and that's what their students in the school should be receiving. And the SLP was very adamant in, no, we don't provide any bilingual services. That's not something that is talked about. We don't have translators, interpreters at our disposal. When they're in our classroom, I have been instructed to provide services in English, and that's what I'm doing every day. And that was the start of our interview. So, I had to adjust kind of some of the things that I wanted to ask because they had made their views, very heard in the beginning. So yes, I did have one of the participants express that.
Okay. Yeah, even pediatricians across the state or elsewhere, they advise parents to, with respect to children on the autism spectrum, to simplify and have services delivered in their primary language or L2 if that's going to be their dominant language.
Right.
And Kylie, can you show your graph with the importance factors again? Because I think that's an interesting piece
Sure.
in terms of how much they consider the severity. I
Sure.
think this may address that question too.
Well, now I can't click, I don't know why. Oh, here we go. Yep, sure.
I told Kylie that it probably took a lot of poise to deal with that interview, because if someone says something you don't agree with, but your role is to interview them, it creates a challenging professional situation.
Yeah, it was absolutely a challenge. Yep. I definitely agree with that, Megan. Yeah, so, when we're looking here at, some of the factors that they're taking into account, you can see here that although it didn't reach significance, there might be a little bit of a trend here for, the low bilingual and monolingual SLPs to take into account the severity of their, communication disorder more than the high bilingual SLPs. But looking at all the other groups, they were pretty evenly matched, beside the language of the school. So, this category is definitely interesting to not only look at, but think about.
I think especially that it's lower than the language of the child.
Right.
So in terms of like the overall emphasis that they're placing on it.
Right.
I think Dr. A and I have monopolized the questions for a while, so would anyone else like to ask any questions? And then if either of us have more, we can ask.
Only because I have to go pretty soon, I thought maybe I could ask the next question. Great job, Kylie.
Thank you.
Listening to that. My question had to do with like the gathering of the survey and how you got interviewees to say yes, and what kind of process that was, and whether there'd be any, we always have to worry about like selection bias, where the people who say yes to doing a survey may not represent the entire population, may or may not.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a
How that went.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. So from the survey, the last question was, would you be interested in participating in a follow-up interview? And there was an option for yes or no. And then if they selected yes, they provided an email. We, labeled the SLPs based on like a code so that we wouldn't know who they were. And we matched up those emails. So we had a long list of emails for SLPs who were interested in the interview. And from there, we looked at, diversity of responses. So what languages did their clients have, so all those the factors we looked at. And then we selected, I think it was 5 or 6 to email first in a first round of hi, thank you so much for wanting to participate. This is what it would entail. We offered them a gift card for participating and taking the time to be a part of the interview. And it was difficult because a lot of the first round of people that I wanted to interview to have the most diverse responses possible either didn't answer or said, no, I'm so sorry, I don't have time right now. So I had to go back and we marked them in red and then kept going down the list, trying to get the most diverse responses that we could so that, the interviews did have data from very diverse clinicians. And we just kept going down the list. And then, once I got 5, which I was interested in getting at least 5, we interviewed those individuals.
And just to follow up quickly, so you had the original 32. How many people do you think you contacted to achieve that?
Yeah, so we had 16 that were interested in the interview. I believe that just filled out the basic survey.
I think Dr. Fryman means how you distributed your survey. How did you get people to fill it out?
Oh, of course, yeah.
The first survey.
Oh, sure, yeah. So we did it through Masha listserv. So that went out. Megan was able to connect me with people there. Also, just people in the department. I have a couple of connections in the schools at home that I emailed asking to participate. My roommate, her mom's an SLP, and it just kind of snowballed from there.
We also used Facebook.
Yeah, Facebook, Instagram. Dr. Ross posted on Instagram, social media. Yeah, so those things.
And also ASHA listservs as well. So it did go out nationally, but we tried to be very clear that they needed to be in Massachusetts.
Right.
But I do want to ask a quick follow-up to that. What did you think, Kylie, about the number of bilingual, like the proportion of your respondents who were bilingual SLPs?
Right. Yeah, we had a lot of bilingual SLPs, participate in the survey. And yeah, it was really interesting to see that the split between the monolingual and bilingual, and then it was also really interesting to see that it was pretty evenly split, in terms of the high, low, and monolingual, looking at those three groups. A lot of the data also would have reached significance if we combined the high bilingual and low bilingual into just a bilingual group compared to a smaller monolingual group. So a lot of those graphs would have reached significance if we had combined those two groups, which was also interesting to look at. Yeah, thank you, Megan, for bringing that up.
So
Sorry,
I have a question, which is, what are your thoughts about why the bilingual SLPs in your sample were using translators and interpreters more than the monolinguals, even when they were in a different language?
Right.
Yeah.
That's a great question. Yeah, thank you for asking that, Dr. Mack. Yeah, it was really interesting. I mean, when Megan and I saw that result come up, both of our brains just started spinning of trying to, figure out why this pattern was showing up. And I could see a couple reasons why. One of them being they might already be working in a place that has a lot of bilingual professionals compared to places that the monolingual SLPs might be working. So they might already be working in a place where they have access to translators and interpreters more, whether it's a school district that, has a lot of students who are speaking multiple languages. I